We'll skip ahead to about 1400 BC, give or take 10 years or so, to Joshua's war for Canaan. This is something that a lot of people have problems with, even believers, because in this war, God tells Joshua and the Israelites to utterly destroy certain people groups. And there are people who will point to this and say, well, this just proves that God is a genocidal maniac. How can a loving God tell his people to go kill and slaughter all of these other people? Well, this is a spiritual war, not just a war of conquest. This is not only a continuation of the Mount Hermon incident, which of course led to the creation of the giants who were in the land in those days. This goes all the way back to the original war, the original rebellion in Eden. The Nakash, serpent, was told by Yahweh in Genesis 3, verse 15, I will put enemy between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. This verse has been misinterpreted in years past as to say that there was a literal bloodline of the serpent, that Eve had relations with the serpent, and that is where Cain came from. That is not biblical. It says right in the text, Adam knew his wife, and there was Cain. This is a spiritual war. The spiritual descendants of the Nakash, those who were sold out spiritually to the Nakash, to the serpent, is what God was talking about here. And there were groups of people in the land that were specifically to be eliminated because they were absolutely sold out to the enemy, the seed of the serpent, if you will. There were several different verbs that God used in giving these instructions to Joshua. One was garash. Forgive my pronunciation. I don't speak Hebrew or even pretend to, but this is as best as I can manage. Garash means to drive out. As an example, Exodus 23:38. Exodus 23:28, typoed. I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out, garash, from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, and so forth. That's the sense of that word, garash. There's another word, yarash, to dispossess. Exodus 34:24, for I will cast out nations before you and enlarge your borders. Numbers 21:32, and Moses sent to spy out Jazer, and they captured its villages and dispossessed the Amorites who lived there. So you've got a couple of different commands here. Dispossess, drive out, and then the third one, karem. Karem essentially means devoted or dedicated to destruction. This is the same root word as the name Mount Hermon, which in a sense means sacred, taboo, as in touch this and you have to die. That's the sense of the word karem, and it's used a lot in the book of Joshua. But there are other examples. Exodus 22:20, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be karem, devoted to destruction. Deuteronomy 3:6, and we devoted them to destruction as we did to Sihon, king of Heshbon. Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. Basically, they all have to die, burn their belongings, don't take any spoil. It all is devoted to destruction. They have signed up with the enemy. They are unredeemable, and they must be destroyed. Well, who was targeted for this ban, this karem? Here we got a map of Canaan before the conquest. In the Transjordan, which is the area east of the Jordan River, east of the Dead Sea, you see the nations of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Those were all Semites. They were all relatives of the Israelites. God told them, you can't have their land. I set that aside for them. But interestingly, in Deuteronomy chapter 2, the instructions that God is giving to Moses makes it clear who formerly lived in those areas. Deuteronomy 2, beginning at verse 19, when you approach the territory of the people of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession. It is also counted as a land of the Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzummim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim, another name to remember. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and lived in their place, as he did for the people of Esau, that's the nation of Edom, who lived in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites before them and dispossessed them and settled them in their place even to this day, and so forth. God telling them, here's who used to live here. These were really tall people, but I cleaned them out so that Edom, Moab, and Ammon would have their possession. Don't touch their land. But there were two kingdoms that were on the hit list. Deuteronomy 2, beginning at verse 30, Sihon, the king of Heshbon. The Lord made his heart obstinate, that he might give him into your hand as he is this day. Sihon came out against us, verse 32. He and all his people to battle at Jahaz, and the Lord gave him over to us. We defeated him and his sons and all his people, and we captured all his cities at that time and devoted to destruction. Every city, men, women, and children, we left no survivors. The other kingdom, Og of Bashan. This one is really interesting. Og of Bashan, we're told in Deuteronomy 3, verse 6, that Og and all of his cities were also devoted to destruction. Kerem. Why? Deuteronomy 3, verse 8, they were the two kings of the Amorites. And then in verse 11, a very interesting footnote to this account of how they were defeated. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. The common cubit is 18 inches long. That means Og's bed was 13 foot 6 and 6 foot wide. That is a large bed. Does this mean Og was a giant? Maybe, but there's more to it. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. Now, they crossed the Jordan into the land of Canaan. The Anakim were in the land. Numbers 13, the report that they got from the spies that were sent into the land 40 years earlier. We saw the descendants of Anak there. And then down at 33, verse 33, and there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. These were the spies who were terrified by the size of the inhabitants of Canaan. They also mention, interestingly, this is a land that devours its inhabitants, which some take as an indication that there were also cannibal giants living in the land, but we won't go there tonight. Now, the interesting thing is that, and this is something I find really exciting, that the more we know about the Holy Land and the ancient Near East from archaeologists, the more we find that what they are discovering tracks with what we read in the Bible. The Egyptians knew the Anakim, and they left records. There are several mentions of a land called Anek around 1900 BC. This is about the time that Abram was raising Isaac, and they were preparing the land, or preparing the family of Abram to possess the land. These are known from what's called the execration texts. The Egyptians had this practice that was sort of like voodoo dolls, where they would take pieces of clay and they would write on the clay the names of their enemies and all of their retainers and all of their family members and anyone who even likes them. And then they would perform a ritual over these pieces of clay, bake them, and then they would smash the clay. Now, some very painstaking and obsessive-compulsive archaeologists have pieced together these little broken pieces of clay. I mean, can you imagine? That's like going into, like the National Archives after a visit by people paid by the Clintons to shred things and having to piece together all the shredded stuff and find out what it said. I was trying to say that carefully. We don't want to, get the bakers in trouble here. Anyway, so the Egyptians knew the Anakim. They had Semitic names, and the Egyptians, in fact, a step further, document the existence of giants in Canaan during this period of time. They were depicted and described in the Egyptian records as nomadic cattle herders, covering most of Canaan south of the Jezreel Valley over into the Transjordan. They called them Shazu, the Shazu, and there's some discrepancy. I mean, scholars can't agree. Were these the Moabites? Were these the Edomites? Were these the Israelites? All of the above, we don't know for sure. But what we do know from a couple of records that have been preserved for us, And I got to believe God's got a sense of humor. Let's preserve this one, and we'll let him find this one. And there's a papyrus called Anastasi I, which is written by a scribe to another scribe. And he recalls an incident in which the second scribe has apparently become notorious because he panicked and crashed his chariot. Because of this incident, and I'm quoting from one English translation, the narrow defile is infested, and this defile was a mountain pass, apparently near Megiddo in Canaan, is infested with shazu concealed beneath the bushes. Some of them are 4 or 5 cubits from head to foot. Fierce of face, their heart is not mild, they hearken not to coaxing. Well, the Egyptian royal cubit, instead of 18 inches, is 20.65 inches, according to scholars. I guess it's like Texas. In Egypt, everything is bigger. That means a shazu measuring 4 or 5 cubits is somewhere between 6'8" and 8'7". But here's another thing, and this is from an inscription celebrating what was described as a victory by the armies of Ramses the Great at the Battle of Kadesh, which was in northern Syria. I mean, again, this is up in the area where the Kurds and the Islamic State are fighting today. Ramses the Great, this inscription shows 2 shazu spies being beaten by Egyptian soldiers. Now, bear in mind, the Egyptians, like a lot of ancient Near Eastern kings, whenever they depicted stuff that wanted to show how great, Assyria is or Babylon is, they would always depict their kings as really big or their guys as really big and the enemy soldiers as really teeny, okay? This one shows 2 shazu spies who've been captured and are being beaten by Egyptian soldiers. Look at the difference in size. The shazu spies are the 2 guys in the middle on their knees, and they are almost as tall as the Egyptian soldiers. Okay? This, again, is known to the Egyptians. The Egyptians left a record for us. We've got documentation. In Canaan, at the time of the Exodus and the conquest, there were giants in the land in those days.